In One Night the Moon, Rachel Perkins has challenged prevailing assumptions of identity and culture. She uses symbolism, colours and shots to attract our attention and confront our perceptions about European and Aboriginal conflict. Rachel Perkins uses narrative to target Eurocentric cultures that ignore and demonise Indigenous cultures by using a historical example, which aims to transform ideas and cultural perspectives. She uses unique camera techniques to relate us to characters who have a similar arrogance, and how even they can have their ideas and assumptions transformed. This allows Eurocentric people to accept Indigenous culture just as Rose does. Rachel uses Jim as a symbolistic, sacrificial lamb character, making him the person who has to die for peace to come. When Jim dies, it takes the weight of a strong European husband and father figure off of Rose, who, in the end, has a change of heart towards Aboriginal culture, and gives the audience a model of how to change the way you think. The story begins with an overhead shot of Jim, slumped and unkempt. It shows an empty beer bottle, signifying his broken state of mind through drinking alcohol, and an unfinished meal which shows he has no desire or care for his personal well-being. In the scene, there is a non-diegetic sound of a solo guitar that presents isolation and the quietness Jim is experiencing in his mind. We can also hear the diegetic rustling of wind that creates an eerie, unsettling atmosphere, which hints that something is wrong. We then see a close-up of Jim looking out his window where, with further viewing of the text, his daughter once was. Jim's face expresses the idea of hope, supported by a bright light that is reflecting off of his face. His face then turns to a frown as he looks away from the window and showers his face with his hands to remove the light. This act symbolizes him losing the light of his life and shows that he is now left in his own darkness. The lyrics then begin.
Once I knew how the world worked.
These lyrics reinforce his cultural disarray and brokenness. As he sings the lyrics, we see him looking down towards the table where he covers his face from the bright light. The lyrics then continue.
You loved your own, you helped your neighbor.
Jim says this as he turns back to the source of light. This is the last time he looks where his daughter once was, before he commits to going and getting his rifle. He then gets up out of his seat using two hands. This little detail shows the effort that he is now using and how spiritually and physically weak he has become. The lyrics, "I don't know anything anymore," show that Jim has lost all sense of identity and place in this now foreign world that he lives in. All of his past assumptions are being challenged and he doesn't know how to deal with them. We see a close-up of a bullet as he sings,
God was good, black was never white.
The lyrics express his confusion about the situation. He is finally understanding his mistakes and how he conformed to the stereotype of ignoring Indigenous people. We then see a zoomed up shot of a rifle exiting a doorway. The camera pans up to Jim presenting the viewer with a low camera angle. The camera angle mixed with Jim's slothful posture and the previous image of a rifle show that Jim is in control and has the power over his decision, specifically with the rifle. We then get interrupted when Jim walks into Emily's bedroom, showing a point of view shot where Emily would likely be. Jim walks further into the room, losing his attention on the rifle and touching the end of the bed. The shot cuts to an empty bed. Jim walks from the bed up to the window. With his eyes, he follows where Emily would likely have trailed, although too late, realizing that his arrogance of not letting Albert track on his land had severed his chances of finding his daughter. His Eurocentric ideology of Indigenous culture was the reason he lost his daughter. He loads the gun and looks out the window, knowing that with this action, there was no going back. He looks out the window with a stern, vigorous face that turns lenient and composed. The camera changes to an outside view where you can see where Jim is looking. We can see that Jim is in anguish and experiencing trauma. The lyrics, "I drove all kindness from my door," mirror him as he leaves Emily's room for the final time. The moment that he realizes his racism has caused him the death of his daughter is the same moment that he loses his assumptions about race and culture. He then walks out his front door, revealing the landscape and limited lifestyle allowed by the wide, barren outback. The music dies as he reaches the fringe of his porch, just as his identity and his previous attitude dies. He steps down, showing little hesitation, not looking back at his old life. The gate at the front of his yard symbolizes ownership. As he exits his land for the last time, the gate is left swinging until it stays open. There's a wide shot of the house with the front gate. As Jim slowly leaves the frame, the house is left isolated, showing there is no ownership and therefore room for a new approach to culture and identity. In the next shot, Jim is facing away from his house, walking into the outback with a gun over his shoulder. The camera deliberately fills the frame with 90% sky, depicting his ascension. This shows that Jim has let go of his ownership to the land and is, in a sense, giving it up by taking his own life. The camera dissolves as we see Jim get further and further away from his house, signifying that he has no intention of returning. The scene finishes by fading to black, leaving the viewers unaware of what is to happen next. It then cuts to the beginning of the narrative, and we see that this scene was a flash-forward technique, meaning that the following story will lead up to the moment that we just saw. Flash-forward narrative telling gives the audience a hint of how the story will conclude. This film technique is used to move the story forward and reveal information about Jim's state of mind. This reinforces the effect of storytelling presented to the audience. Moving forward throughout the text, we see Jim in a scene that precedes the flash-forward sequence. The scene where Albert, the indigenous man who Jim has demonized, brings home Jim's child, who is deceased. The first thing to notice is that Rachel Perkins has chosen to film on a cloudy day to change the mood of the scene. The lighting also changes to monotone, creating an eerie altitude that shows the grief and darkness being represented. Rachel Perkins also purposely made the soundtrack play in a minor chord. Due to cultural conditioning, when we listen to tunes, we rely heavily on our memory for the body of music. This is why music in a major key is judged as happy, while music in a minor key is heard as sad. This causes us to generate expectations of what might come next in a scene. Viewing the scene, we see that the handheld camera technique is being used. The shaking coming from the camera is done on purpose to let the audience feel the gravity of the scene, and station them in the experiences of the characters. Rachel does this in the scene to let us feel the grief that Rose is experiencing after the loss of her daughter. She is also realizing how arrogant she and her husband was for not letting Albert track Emily from the beginning. This causes her views on Albert's culture to become unbalanced, which is represented by the unstable camera style. In one of the shots, we see Rose hugging her late daughter in the arms of Albert. Rose no longer shows any bitterness towards Albert. The monotone filter causes the colors of their shirts to mix, showing unification and how her resent for him has been broken. We then go to a shot of Jim in his house, where the color balance has been restored, signifying us being placed in Jim's shoes. He slowly rises from his seat and makes his way outside. When Jim notices that Albert is with his wife on his land, he runs and jumps off his porch, ready to attack Albert. But he then notices that Albert is carrying his daughter. He slows down, ignoring the fact that Albert is on his property, which he had a fit about earlier in the movie. The music goes silent as Jim and Albert approach each other. From different cultures and with different views, they meet together on common ground. Jim lets his guard down and makes eye contact with Albert. This is a big moment for Jim. Before, he used to refuse to make any contact with Albert, not even wanting to look at him. But now, Albert is on his land with his wife, holding his daughter. All of Jim's cultural perspectives and ideas of identity are being broken, just as Rose's were. Albert hands over Jim's daughter, showing remorse on his face and an understanding of his loss. Albert takes off his hat in a gesture of respect and hastily leaves his land. The camera does a zoom in on Jim as he is left aimlessly gazing upon his dead daughter, his mouth wide open. The camera zooms into a close-up to show focus on Jim. In this moment, Jim has lost all Eurocentric beliefs about Albert and Indigenous Australians. Losing these beliefs, there is nothing but complete shame and guilt running through Jim's mind. The diegetic sound of wind rustling over an empty field shows the quietness of Jim's mind, not knowing what to do. It is then where the camera fades to black and we're transitioned into the flash-forward sequence. Rachel Perkins has used Albert's and Jim's relationship with the use of film techniques to show how Eurocentric belief and culture can be transformed and adjusted to accept other cultures such as Indigenous people. Thank you for listening.